the objectives of Sharia, and when we last had left, we left with the concept of illah. If you remember, the concept of direct cause or operative cause behind every legal injunction, behind every legal verdict, behind every hukm, and in particular in the realm of mu'amalat. Remember that? And then we said that in the Islamic fiqh, that the principle is al-ahkamu bi'ilaliha. Al-ahkamu taduru ma'ilaliha wujudan wa adama. That the legal verdicts in Islamic fiqh, in Islamic Sharia, change if the illah changes. If that operative cause or that direct cause changes. And I think I recited for you also a statement by Ibn al-Arabi, rahimahullah ta'ala. Did I do that? Oh yes. And he said, فَكُلُّ مَا فَعَلَهُ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وسلم لحكمة وحاجة وسبب وجب أن السبب إذا ارتفع أن يرتفع ذلك الحكم وإذا عاد أن يعود ذلك الحكم. End of quote. Which means that everything that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam did for a hikmah, for a purpose, for a reason, or for a need, or for a sabab, for a cause, it becomes then obligatory. Wajaba, it's in other words, it's a logical extension, it's a logical necessity, that if the sabab, if the cause is removed, changes, then it has become obligatory that that hukm, that legal verdict, that which he did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would also be removed and would also change. And examples in that, of course, existed in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the time of the Sahaba, in the time of the Tabi'een, and still exist nowadays. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in many instances, for instance, is recorded to have given a legal verdict under certain circumstances, and when then those circumstances changed, in order to protect and preserve the objective, you remember those 5 universals and so on, for that original purpose to be preserved, conditions change, something has to change. You know that's part of conservation of energy. Do you know what I mean? So something has to change. And that which changes in the field of the temporal, in the field of the mu'amalat, then the hukm changes, it adjusts in its actualization, in its implementation, it adjusts in order to preserve the original purpose. So here he said, do not go visit cemeteries at all. It's prohibited to visit cemeteries. And then some time later, after certain conditions changed, that have to do with preserving aqeedah from shirk, as used to be prevalent in those days, he says, I had previously prohibited you, لَقَدْ كُنْتُ نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ فَزُورُوهَا فَإِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُكُمُ الْمَوْتِ أَوْ كَمَا قَالَ صلى الله عليه وسلم. I had previously prohibited you from visiting graves, cemeteries, that is. Now you may go and visit them, for they remind you of death. There was something that was going on. The people were very new in their faith, in the new deen, and they had very strong attachment to certain idolatrous practices when it comes to dead relatives and dead peoples that exist still nowadays in the world, and the idea of grave worship and of the wrong things that are done in the presence of graves and cemeteries and all that, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, that nonsense of superstitions and so on. And alhamdulillah, but when he educated them, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and they internalized his teachings, and that did not make any more difference to them, then he says, now you may go, because the maslahah, the benefit of remembering death now is not anymore subverted, if you will, by the harm of the probable shirk that would ensue from your visits to the graves, as used to be before you were educated by this deen. And it is this way, Allah Akrimak, that Al-Imam Ibn Al-Arabi, for example, when it comes to the case of the traveling of a woman without a mahram, as many of you know, there are texts by Rasulullah ﷺ that prohibit women from traveling alone, especially far distances, without the presence of a mahram. The ulama, rahimahumullah ta'ala, had different views as to the hukm, the judgment on this matter, under all circumstances and in different circumstances. And there are those who say that the presence of a mahram is necessary. The presence of a mahram is not a rationalizable concept, like Imam Abu Hanifa, for instance. And yet other scholars argued later, of course it is a rationalizable concept. And of those is Al-Imam Ibn Al-Arabi of the Maliki school of thought of centuries ago, one Andalusian scholar, Spanish quote-unquote Muslim scholar of many centuries ago, when he said, he debated, in other words, the opinion of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, and he finds it, in accordance to his words, of the ajab, ya lal ajab, what a wondrous thing to say, that the question of mahram is not rationalizable in a trip of a woman. When you say that zakah is rationalizable, and therefore in zakatul fitr, instead of necessarily giving the needy people wheat and barley and dates, as the text of Rasulullah ﷺ taught in those days, you say this is rationalizable because the intent and the reason is to benefit the needy of the poor, and in any which way you benefit the needy of the poor, then you can do that, and therefore you can give the value to the needy and the poor from zakah, that is money or other thing that has the same value, rather than that same foodstuff itself. And then he says, and this matter about traveling of a woman and the presence of a man traveling with her who is a mahram, you argue that it is not rationalizable. He says, in other words, ya lal ajab, this is strange and wondrous. In other words, he does not agree with him. He says, on the contrary, this is a rationalizable matter. And because the ulama, in the analysis of the text of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and having known this principle that is just laid down here, the change of law with the change of illah, he says, and they found the illah in this case to be the safety and the protection of the woman in terms of her honor, her life, and her sanctity and chastity. Rather, then they say, by any means that security and safety is achieved, so it is the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore he argued, that scholars argued, who are of this opinion, that if a woman travels not with a mahram, but with the presence of a group of people, like a trustworthy man, that will probably therefore imply the guarantee of her life and chastity and so on, and honor, then she may travel without the presence of that mahram. And here is a change of hukm with a change of the illah behind it, preserving the original purpose, because that's what the law is about, to preserve that original purpose. Namely, when Rasulullah ﷺ says she does not travel alone, they concluded from those texts and other texts that he intended, the lawgiver intended by that, the safety and protection of the woman in her life, in her sanctity, in her chastity, in her honor. And the mahram usually is the means by which that is achieved in those societies. So to preserve the purpose, when conditions change, something changes to continue to preserve the original purpose. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the companion Umar ibn al-Khattab, is well known. His fiqh is very famous. about the many examples in his life of judge and in his life of Khalifa and in his life of Mufti radiallahu ta'ala anh, when many instances changed because of the change of illah. It is well established. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim has a full book almost in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in about the fiqh of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anh, and the Maqasidi fiqh of Umar, that the fiqh of Umar is par excellence the fiqh of Maqasid, the fiqh of the objectives of Sharia, and that the fiqh of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anh was exemplifying the teachings of fiqh of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And here he decides in his time sallallahu alayhi wa sallam that the category of people that Allah mentions in the Quran, al-mu'allafatu qulubuhum, the 8 categories that Allah speaks about in Surah At-Tawbah, that they are recipients for zakah. إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل. المؤلفة قلوبهم is one category mentioned explicitly by Allah Azza wa Jalla in the Quran. Umar ibn al-Khattab in his Khilafah, and that continued in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the time of Abu Bakr, and in his time he says no zakatu al-mu'allafatu qulubuhum. The hukm changes. Why? Because the illah changes. Because in the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, in his time, certain circumstances changed that were intended by that law of giving zakah to the mu'allafatu qulubuhum. The purpose behind giving zakah to the mu'allafatu qulubuhum was no more present in the way, in any significant and remarkable way, in the time of Rasul, in the time of of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and therefore he said no zakah to those people. It is the way it is actualized, the way the text is actualized. The text did not change. I hope you understand that. The text, the evidence did not change. What changed is the application, is the actualization of that text in view of the preservation of the purpose intended behind the words or the law in that text. And because that is what the law is, it has a purpose, and we have established already that that purpose is to preserve and promote the 5 universal at all different levels. And this is a case of it, and I would like to say more about it, but I have to say more inshallah ta'ala so that all of this is clear. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for instance, a simple example in the lives of people, when a man came and asked him, and that's a text recorded, authentically recorded, Ya Rasulullah, what happens if we find a lost camel that belongs to someone lost and no owner claims it? It's lost, erring in the desert. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the text means leave it. Leave it. There is water around and there is vegetation around until the owner finds it. That's the bill of law, the piece of legislation, if you will. It was so in the time of Abu Bakr. It was so in the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And in the time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anh, that application of that law changed. What Uthman did radiallahu ta'ala anh, he said, instead, if anyone, the law is, if anyone finds such an erring or lost camel, then you take it. You take a hold of it, and you take it to your, to your property, and you feed it, and you take care of it until the owner comes and shows evidence that it is his or hers and claims it, and it is given to them. Think about this for a while. While you're doing that, in the time of Ali radiallahu ta'ala anh, this law changes again. Ali radiallahu ta'ala anh says, if such a thing occurs in his time, then you must bring it to Baytul Mal. In other words, the state takes hold of it, takes care of it, feeds it until the owner comes and shows proof of ownership and is given to him. The law changed few times. Rasulullah ﷺ said something, yet those who came after him did what seems to be something different, yet they did all the same thing. Because the purpose behind that, as is understood, I think if you even a little bit carefully think about it, what was the purpose behind that? The well-being of the camel. It's very obvious. To preserve property. Yeah, that's the purpose, the preserving property. And a camel is something very valuable. Don't think of a camel like you Canadian here. A camel, what do I need with a camel? What's the worth of a camel? No. It's like a horse that costs $1 million here. The well-being of the camel is what is at stake here, what is intended. In the time of Uthman, perhaps what has happened is what? Lack of trust, more thieves, more people who cheat. Because the person who is, until he finds it, the owner finds it. Well, there are people who will find it and will steal it and will never give it to the owner. Or will, or perhaps what has happened is there was scarcity, in this case, scarcity of water and vegetation. And there is more risk for the camel to die, to be lost, the property to be lost. So Uthman says, you take a hold of it, and you take care of it for your brother, for the owner. You don't want the property of a Muslim to be wasted and to be lost like that. It's not good, it's not right. It violates the purpose of the preservation of property. And then in the time of Ali, years later, at least perhaps 10 or 13 years later, then something must have changed. And he said instead, no, let the state take care of that. Perhaps then there were thieves, and we know that by that time there was a lot of political strifes and a lot of problems amongst in the society. So I would say there would be concern also for property to be abused and misused and stolen and so on. So you keep it and you preserve the very purpose for which Rasulullah ﷺ said, do this. And these are examples among many, many hundreds of examples in Islamic law where we can see this principle clearly actualized from the time of Rasulullah ﷺ throughout the centuries. The next important part to talk about here in the context of the objectives of Sharia, we have talked about priorities a little bit. And we have pointed out from Shariah arguments, at least to some extent, that the study of priorities and the knowledge of priorities is an essential part in a final legal verdict by a Muslim scholar or by a judge or by a legislator. Very, very fundamental. The other concept is the concept of al-ma'al. Ma'al, or probably translated as I would translate it as, and this is because of the legal connotation that it contains, probable consequences. The probable consequences of an act or of a statement or of any tasarruf. What does this mean? Since Sharia came to preserve those universes that we spoke about, at the levels that we spoke about, with a rationale behind each each law, as we have mentioned, the intent behind that rationale is to be the probable cause for the fulfillment of the hikmah itself, of the objective itself. And all of that points very clearly, as we have said earlier, excuse me, about fulfilling that which is maslaha and warding off that which is mafsada. Maslaha, benefit and beneficial and well-being. Mafsada, that which is harmful and destructive and wrong, and so on. So the Sharia came on any issue to maximize maslaha and to minimize mafsada, to maximize good and well-being and interest in accordance to those values that we talked about, and to minimize harm to them at all levels. And the ma'al, the study of the probable consequences of a thing, of a word, or of a statement, or of a conduct, or of a piece of legislation, to study the probable consequences of that is part of this Shariah system. And since we're speaking about ma'al is, if you will, a separate entity from the text. Ma'al is a separate entity from the text. Because we're talking about the probable consequences of applying the text the way the text requires to be applied. And we're talking about the text. Now, let us understand one thing before I give an example and I say further about this. There is what we call already al-kulliyat, those universals. And there is what we call also al-juz'iyat. Universals and wholes, something that is whole and something that is partial, or juz'i means partial, literally. But what do we mean by that in the context of the law here? You understand by now that those universals, we call them universals because of the nature of what comprehensiveness in them, the nature of generality in them, the nature of all-inclusiveness in them. Do you understand? This is juz'i, this is a subset, if you will. This is an element, a small element. Example, just this is an example. The human being, the race of a human being is a concept that is kulli. American, Canadian, Algerian, French, Pakistani is juz'i in that kulli of a human race. Okay? The Quran is a kulli. Verses of the Quran are juz'iyat. The concept of justice is kulli. Specific incidents and cases between individuals of justice or the lack thereof are juz'iyat. You may have a story in the Quran or a real case in human life, in human interactions, that has to do with rendering justice in a specific, that's a juz'i. And therefore, let's say a judge, when he is adjudicating in an issue between two parties, supposedly, always fairness, no, justice is to be in his mind. Adl. That's the kulli. And if he finds a text in the law, if he does law good and intelligently and systematically, if you find a text in the law that seems in its application in a specific case violating the constant of justice, then what must he do? Readjust the interpretation of the text, or readjust the actualization of the text to preserve the justice, the constant, the kulli. And so it is absolutely in Islamic Sharia and in Islamic fiqh. Juz'iyat are understood and interpreted in the light of kulliyat. Why? It's simply also rational and logical, because a juz'i is an element of the kulli. A juz'i is an element of the kulli. The kulli, I would do this way. You know this sign in math? When you have two sets, which one? This set belongs to this one. Or if you have an element, then you have A belongs to B. Or it should be this way. A, small a, pertains to B. But when it comes to sets, this is an element, this is a set. When you have two sets, then you have this inclusion. Juz'i is included in a kulli. And since juz'i is included in a kulli, you cannot understand the juz'i disjoint from the kulli. If you want to understand one, you cannot understand it outside of a set of million, for example. So the juz'iyat that are the specific texts of the Quran or the specific text of the hadith, they are called juz'iyat, for example. Dalilun juz'i and dalil kulli, the Quran, for example. You cannot understand one text in isolation from the rest of the Quran. That's a fact. Therefore, you cannot also understand a juz'i in the Quran in isolation from the kulli of the Quran. And the kulli in the Quran, for example, there are kulliyat in the Quran like justice. It's a constant, it's an inviolable constant. So in applying the law in any situation, at the juz'i level, at the specific level, we must understand the text in the light of the kulli. And that's another Shariah legal principle that is very, very fundamental, which basically is repeating in a different way what we had already established about the about maqasid in al-Shariah versus the illah and the hukm. Similarly, we cannot understand juz'iyat, we cannot understand or apply kulliyat isolated and disjoint from juz'iyat. We cannot do that either. It's very essential and very important. Because the juz'iyat in the Quran and in the Sunnah are telling us about how the kulliyat manifest themselves in reality. And it's quite an involved and very sophisticated, of course, scholarly approach, and where the ulama, of course, show their abilities, rahimahumullah ta'ala. If we understand this, and I think the examples that we gave about just previously about the hukm of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anh, and the hukm of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam before that, and the hukm of Uthman and Ali, we will understand this as well. And then the ma'al question. The ma'al tells us if there is a text, if there is a juz'i text, and that says do so or don't do so, and so on. That's the text. It is imperative also to study the probable consequences when we actualize that text in reality. And when we say probable consequences, we mean what? How does the actualization of this text affect the lives of peoples, individuals or collective individuals, collective entities, at the level of their deen. Remember those 5 universals? At the level of their deen, at the level of their lives, at the level of their minds, at the level of their properties, at the level of their progenies and families. We have to study that as well before the scholar, the Muslim scholar, the able Muslim scholar, and the really muhaqqiq of the scholars, or the judge, before they pass a judgment or before they make official a fatwa to be a hukm, for instance. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there are examples in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and thereafter, and there are many. And I'm going to begin with 2 or 3 because time does not allow. Allah Azza wa Jalla in the Quran says, for example, وَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ فَيَسُبُّوا اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. I think this is in Surah Al-An'am, is it? Al-Ma'idah? No. It's in Al-An'am. فلا تسبوا, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, ولا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله فيسبوا الله عدوا بغير علم. Do not curse at the kuffar. ولا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله. Do not curse at those who worship and call other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are kuffar. What do you mean? We don't curse their idols? We don't. No, you don't. And one of the reasons given has to do with probable consequences. فَيَسُبُّ اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. Then they would, in a sense, naturally reciprocate, and therefore they will curse at God, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, and that would be transgression and udwan, and that would be ignorance and jahl, and they would do that out of ignorance. And in other words, you don't want yourselves to carry the burden of Allah Azza wa Jal being cursed at by others. You don't want to hear that. You don't want to see that. And if you cursed at them, then you have done that in a sense. Then you have contributed to that. Kufr is wrong. Kufr is haram. Kufr is ugly. Kufr is terrible. Idols other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, other than God, are rijs and najis. But Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ. Don't curse at those who worship other than Allah Azza wa Jalla. السببية فَيَسُبُّ اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. Consequently, they would curse وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ at God ignorantly and treacherously, and it would be an act of oppression. So because of, not because of the act itself being wrong, but because of the probable consequence. Number 2, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in his time, and he's a Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, many companions told him, Ya Rasulullah, you know who the munafiqun are. You know who the munafiqun are, because Allah Azza wa Jal told him about their names, because nifaq is something inside the heart. Those people who harbor hate and shirk and kufr and hostility, together with all of that, against Allah and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the people and so on, but they show externally that they are believers. And it's a matter harbored in the heart, and people don't know that. God knows. And the companions many times told Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ya Rasulullah, why don't you punish them and even kill them? And he says no. And he says no. And then one of the reasons he gave, that the scholars cite rahimahullah ta'ala, is people will say Muhammad kills his friends. Probable consequence. Because people don't know what I know. The world doesn't know what I know. You don't know what I know. When they see these people who look apparently very close friends, and they externally and apparently that's what they do, and I will kill them because of what I know they have done and they're doing and they're intending to do, or because of what they harbor, then people are going to see only a friend being killed by a friend. And he says, no, I will not do that. And he was right, of course. He is the one who expresses the divine will in legislation. Third example, there are many examples. Which one? Yeah, in the time of Rasulullah, he said to Aisha radiallahu ta'ala, it's another authentic hadith. You know the Kaaba? The Kaaba is a place that was revered by the mushriks before Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, because it was a practice from the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And with time, idolatry was introduced, but some early teachings and practices of Ibrahim alayhi salam were still done. So they used to revere the Kaaba because they knew, of course, of Ibrahim. It was their patriarchal figure, our ancestor, our father, the children of Ismail. And they believed, of course, that they were worshipping God. I hope you know that. They always believed that they were worshipping Allah. They were worshipping Allah, but their own ways. And they had idols inside the Kaaba, as you know, and outside of it, etc., etc. And what had happened when Ibrahim alayhi salam had built the Kaaba first, he had built it originally, and in accordance to the original design as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala probably revealed to him or inspired him to do. And what happened with time is Quraysh, and before that the tribes of Jurhum, centuries earlier, had rebuilt the Kaaba, the walls of the Kaaba. And later on, Quraysh rebuilt those walls again and excluded part that was in the original walls of the Kaaba. That's why when you go to the Kaaba, that which is called the Hijr Ismail, that was all part of the Kaaba. That was all inside the Kaaba. And that's why if you perform your salah inside the Hijr, it's like you have performed salah inside the Kaaba. That's the space that has that sanctity. The walls are just walls, but not just any walls. So he said sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to Aisha, which means were it not that people, the Muslims, had still attachment to their Jahiliyyah habits, I would have rebuilt the Kaaba in accordance to the original design of Ibrahim alayhi salam. But he didn't, and he's Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Of course, through what he does is that he teaches his ummah what Shariah is and how to approach law and change. But because of the concern that those people are such an attachment to these things, or because others will say, who are still mushrik and others, oh, Muhammad has no reverence for religious symbols. For his own religious symbols, look, he destroys the walls and he builds them again and so on. So he says, لولا أن قومك قريب عهد بجاهلية لأعدت بناء الكعبة على أسس إبراهيم عليه السلام. So he didn't do that for a probable consequence that is not a matter of really very, very essential matter of deen. This was more of a, perhaps, of a matter of tahsiniyat in deen. And the probable consequences were not so good, and it was not necessary. So he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, leave it as such, leave it as is. And in the time of the Sahaba, and in the time of Rasulullah, more examples about weighing the probable consequences before the final verdict and the final judgment for saying words or for action in order for it to be Shariah. And here we read Al-Imam Al-Shatibi rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the greatest again Muslim jurists from the Maliki school as well, in his great formidable work of jurisprudence of Al-Muwafaqat. He says, rahimahullah, after having given many juz'iyat, many texts and examples and specific cases to demonstrate in his own style of statistical approach, of inductive reasoning, to demonstrate this concept, and he does it wonderfully, rahimahullah ta'ala. And then he says, and again this must be memorized by many people who are very serious in the field of legal studies and Sharia studies. He says rahimahullah ta'ala, فَتَنَبَّهْ إلى هذا فَتَنَبَّهْ, pay attention therefore in this matter. And he says, وضابطها أنك تعرض مسألتك على الشريعة فإن صحت في ميزانها فانظر في مآلها بالنسبة إلى حال الزمان وأهله. فإذا لم يؤدي ذكرها إلى مفسدة فاعرضها في نفسك على العقول فإن قبلتها العقول فلك أن تتكلم بها على العموم إن كانت مما تتقبلها العقول على العموم وإما على الخصوص إن كانت غير كذلك and then he says فإن لم يكن لمسألتك هذا المساغ فالسكوت عنها هو اللائق بالمصلحة الشرعية والعقلية. End of quote. What does this mean? He says رحمه الله تعالى, تنبه, pay attention. ضابطها, that is the norms that you need to keep in mind for this issue of probable consequences in studying any matter, any issue legally from the Shariah perspective, is that first you subject it to Sharia texts. If it is acceptable in the balance of Sharia, that is Sharia texts, then the next step, step 2, study, in other words, فانظر, study its consequences. فانظر في مآلها, study its consequences relative to the circumstances of people and their times. بالنسبة إلى what did I say? حال الزمان وأهله. Pertaining to the circumstances of their times and pertaining to the circumstances of the peoples of that time in which this situation is taking place. And then if you reach the conclusion that this does not lead to any harm, to any mafsada, فإن لم يؤدي ذكرها إلى مفسدة, then you may make it public. However, لك أن no, I'm sorry, before that, no, as a matter of fact, no, there is something that I didn't talk about which is very specific, very interesting, that Imam Shatibi talks about, rahimahullah ta'ala. Before you do that, if it passes that test, there is no mafsada in it. Remember we spoke about, of course, the Shara always weighs masalih and mafasid. Then if this good thing, that has passed the test of the Shari'i scrutiny of the texts, then the second thing you look at, does it have harmful consequences? And mafsada, he knows as a scholar, of course, he's talking about those elements that I mentioned to you. Then there is a third thing. If it passes the second test, then the third thing is فَعَرَضْهَا فِي نَفْسِكَ عَلَى الْعُقُولِ. What does this mean? He says, before you speak it, before you say it, before you share it, before you make it public, in other words, study it in your own self as to how would people receive it in their minds. Are the minds ready or not ready to receive it? Are the minds ready or not ready to receive it? Is this something that if you were to say, people will understand it and will receive it very normally? It doesn't cause any other problems, in other words. فَعَرِضْهَا فِي نَفْسِكَ عَلَى الْعُقُولِ. And then فَإِن تَقَبَّلَتْهَا الْعُقُولِ, then if you find that this is acceptable to the average mind, especially to the average people and to the minds that you are going to address, in other words also, then you may, in this case, speak it, but then he sets another condition. And so intelligent and so true indeed. Then you may speak about it either in general terms or in specific terms, depending on whether or not that question is open to being spoken about generally or specifically, and how the minds will accept it. Will they accept it in general, as general information, or do you need to be more specific to tell them about it, or to express it, or to, and so on? Which one do the minds accept? If it is in general terms, then you say it in general terms. If it is in specific terms, then you say it in specific terms. Probable consequences. And then he says, what is it, number 4 or 5? Very, subhanAllah, this is a key also sentence, rahimahullah ta'ala, summarizing this long and arduous and very, very complex synthesis of the details of Sharia. And he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, فإن لم يكن لمسألتك هذا المساغ فالسكوت عنها هو الجاري حسب المصلحة الشرعية والعقلية. Then if your matter, if this matter does not have any of the above recourse, it does not fit any of those, it does not, in other words, it does not fulfill those requirements and those conditions, then he says, not to speak it at all is what fulfills both the Shariah benefits as well as the aqli benefits. In other words, both aql and shar' agree, both reason and shar' are in agreement that not to say anything is what preserves and promotes the well-being. فإن لم يكن لمسألتك هذا المساغ فالسكوت عنها هو الجاري حسب المصلحة الشرعية والعقلية. I hope many of you or some of you or hopefully all of you inshallah ta'ala and all of us understand the depth of this discourse and of this statement and the practicality of this statement. And I repeat, this is not only primarily for judges and jurists and lawyers, it is primarily, but this concept can be used at home. This concept can be used everywhere. It has its benefits. Everywhere. In administration, in family administration, in management. Subhanallah, because it has to do with well-being, benefit, properly of course analyzed, and harm. Sharia everywhere and all the time. Those who use Sharia properly and use its principles properly has always been very, very meticulous about the consequences of actions and of words. This is after it passes the test of ميزان الشرع. Always. To preserve what? Again, the original purpose, the original objectives. Always. That's why it is well established through the, for example, the teaching of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, لا ضرر ولا ضرار. This is an unequivocal, constant legal principle. لا ضرر ولا ضرار. Let there be no harm initiated, nor harm reciprocated with the intent to inflict pain. As ضرار. ضرر, لا ضرر ولا ضرار. Look at the eloquence of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Two words which you cannot put in any two words, I believe, in any other language. You have to say many words to put it as concisely and as briefly as possible. And this rule of law that became the golden rule in Islamic law as well has many corollary rules and corollary axioms, such as درء المفاسد أولى من جلب المصالح, such as the very famous rule of law and principle of Islamic law that says درء المفاسد أولى من جلب المصالح. You must memorize this too. درء المفاسد أولى من جلب المصالح. The warding off, the prevention of harm takes precedence over the drawing of benefit. That's a principle. That's an axiom. That's a kulli axiom, but not as kulli as those kulliyat that we spoke about. And the tons and the thousands of texts fulfill that principle. Juz'iyat that fulfill this principle. And let me say a little more about it so that it's clearly understood, and then we close here inshaAllah ta'ala. We're travelers anyway, so we can afford this, especially for a reason of ilm and of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Fatwa Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma is well known for some of you, inshaAllah ta'ala. Again, it is established that if we have a situation, a case or two cases where we are dealing with the same level of universals, remember? And at the same time, the same level of universals, two issues with the same level of universals, and now we want to realize which one to do. This rule is very fundamental to help us with that. First of all, let us establish that if the benefit, when we study the consequences, if the benefit outweighs the harm, the benefit properly studied, not speculatively studied, not hawa-wise studied, but some of those rules that we have spoken about, the universals, the levels, and all of that has to be studied properly. If the result is that the benefit outweighs the harm, then what happens? Then we do that thing. If the consequences lead to, the study of the consequences lead to the result that the harm outweighs the benefit, then it is, you don't do that. That's haram anyways, at least. That's haram. Now this rule of dar'ul mafasid awla min jalb al-masalih would be applied next. And that is when, let's say, our study shows that there is equality between the maslaha and the mafsada, at whatever level of our analysis, probabilistically or certainly, we reach that conclusion. Then which one to go with? It's not, oh, I like this maslaha, but this mafsada. The rule says, because the rule, it became a rule after thorough studies of the words of Allah and the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the precedents of the seerah and the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba and so on, the rule says warding off harm takes precedence over drawing in benefit. And therefore, what do? You don't. Because if you did, it will bring benefit and it will bring equal harm. And you don't do it. Because you ward off harm. Warding off harm takes precedence over drawing in benefit. درء المفاسد أولى من جلب المصالح. And therefore, when we will study together, inshallah, again, al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, all of these are so essential. To change that which is wrong and to enjoin that which is evil must never be done without the knowledge and the study of the probable consequences. And therefore, you are not allowed in law, in Sharia, in Islam, to change an evil by committing a similar evil equal to it or greater than it. That's a rule of law, which is how is it phrased? One of the ways it is usually phrased, لا يغير المنكر بمنكر مثله أو أكبر منه. And I will, inshallah, remember the other formulation of it. And that's, it is not permissible to change an evil, a harmful thing, by committing an equally harmful thing or a worse thing in harm. And therefore, if you are faced with a situation, and there's another corollary of that rule of la darara wa la dirar, if we're faced with a situation where the only alternative is two wrong things, and I think this, it's rational also. The only alternative is to take two harmful things. It's the only alternative that will help you, for example, save something much more important. Then which one do you have to take? The least harmful. If you have to use two harmful ways or means to protect and save a much greater benefit, then, and that's the only recourse, then you cannot use the greater evil to do that. You have to, if you have to, then you choose the lesser of the two evils, as they say. And you have recourse to that which is called evil only if there's the only recourse. To save something that is much greater than the evil you are going to commit. And therefore, for example, when someone is a murderer and kills life unjustly, when justice takes hold of him or her and goes through the process of due process of law and is found guilty, then where there is, even in secular law, where there is capital punishment, that person is to be executed. Is killing a person, killing the person as such, if you look at it only, is it evil or good? It's evil. But why was it permitted in Sharia? Under many conditions, which many I know don't know. And it's a beautiful thing to know about that. It's because generally and statistically, when you do that, you are going to save the lives of many more. The lives of many more people. This person will stop killing, number one. More people. Number two, those who, if they see this not severely punished, they will themselves, inside of themselves, there will be a decrease of reverence for life and of fear from the consequences of destroying life. The result of that, of losing one life, is preserving many more lives. And that's what Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. In qisas, and it's not capital punishment, or it's not, qisas is a beautiful word, and I'll go perhaps on another occasion, we'll talk more about the linguistics of this. In qisas, you have life, O you who think properly. He says, in qisas you have life. Subhanallah. In qisas you have life. And that cannot be denied or ignored. Definitely, statistically, in every country, and especially if you study that over an extended period of time, there is no doubt about it. And I'm not talking about capital punishment, I'm talking about qisas. And what qisas means in Islamic law, and the methods that are approached, and the ways that is done, that is definitively deterring, and definitively also rehabilitating. And it is a rahmah, no doubt about it. You will have to ask me questions later about why is it rahmah, why is it special, why is it rehabilitating as well. That perhaps maybe we'll have the occasion to talk about in other sessions, if Allah wills. Otherwise, when Allah Azza wa Jal subhanahu wa ta'ala permits and allows. There is much more that one would like to and need to cover, at least to let everybody know, and students of Islamic law know, about the system of Sharia, and about the consistency of Islamic law, and about the objectives of Islamic law. But alhamdulillah, I hope in what was said, I hope, inshallah, and I pray that there is enough to begin to realize that beauty of the Sharia, and that it will instill in the hearts and minds of many of you the desire and the urge and the energy to study that more, inshallah ta'ala, and to discover with your own, alhamdulillah, arduous work, to begin to not only to know it in general terms, but to begin to appreciate it in its details, and to have a feel for it that is very necessary for those who are in the fields of law, and in the fields of being judges and of being legislators, or of those who want to study in depth the philosophy and the methodologies of Islamic law. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم. إن قلت صوابا فمن الله وحده، وإن قلت غير ذلك فمن نفسي ومن جهلي ومن الشيطان. أعوذ بالله أن أذكر به وأنساه. Had I said anything correct, it's from Allah alone. Anything incorrect or improper, it's my own ignorance, the weakness of my own nafs, and the impact of shaitan upon me. I seek refuge in Allah, that I remind you of Him and yet myself forget Him. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.